Senator McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Acting Deputy President. It distresses me that on this particular bill I might be seen voting with the Greens political party, but my opposition to this bill is now 12 months old. And I made it quite clear 12 months ago when these measures were first talked about that I would be opposing this aspect of the government's repair job. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, I, as much as anyone, understand the difficult job our government has had in trying to repair Labor's financial mess. And as everyone knows, if something wasn't done about it, the debt owing by the Australian taxpayer would have increased to something like $700 billion in a very short period of time. Already we're paying something like $1 million a day in interest on money that the previous Labor government borrowed. And that's $1 million each and every day that's not going to hospitals and schools and roads. And it really shows just how completely incompetent the Labor Party was. And I know our government had that very difficult job in last year's budget to try and arrest that decline. And I had last year and over the past year opposed certain elements of last year's budget, most of which I'm pleased to say have now been addressed. And while some people didn't like the approach I took to some of the initiatives in last year's budget, I am, as I say, pleased to say that nearly all of those that I complained about and argued about have been understood and in one form or another adopted by the government. And by contrast with this last year's budget, I think this year's budget is a credit to Mr Hockey and Senator Cormann, and indeed the government as a whole. It has set the country on the right path. But Madam Acting Deputy President, I am opposed to this bill, and I said so last year. I indicated publicly last year that I would vote against this measure, but the government, in its wisdom last year, found a lawful mechanism whereby they could introduce the excise as I understand it, a customs regulation that didn't need to come before this Parliament. But it was said by the government at the time that using this mechanism under the Customs Act, as I understand it, it did have to come before Parliament within 12 months for parliamentary approval. And I indicated 12 months ago that when that did happen, I would be voting against this, and I intend to honour that commitment I made to myself, but more importantly to the people that I represent in this country. Now, so I will be opposing it for a different reason to Senator Bernardi, who has long held a view which he so articulately represented today. I have a different view to him, but the same conclusion. I oppose this excise increase. I'll be voting against the bill, and certainly on very, very different grounds to those enunciated by the Labor Party, and which I'm sure will be even further talked about by the next speaker from the Greens political party. The Greens political party oppose this because they don't have any regard for people who live outside the privileged capital cities that have a tram system, a suburban train system, a public bus system on every corner. That's all the Greens are concerned about. They want more money for public transport. That's great. There's not much public transport in Croydon or Normanton or Julia Creek or even Mount Isa. And, Madam Acting Deputy President, this is why the Greens on this and on so many other things are completely wrong. And in fact, whilst opposing this bill, I congratulate the government and thank them from the bottom of my heart that the additional money that will be raised by this facility will go into as I understand it, a hypothecated fund for road construction over the future, and it will provide funds for road building around our nation, even in excess of the monies that have been announced by the government to date. And I give the government every credit for that, and I congratulate them for it. And in that way, I completely oppose the reasonings of the Greens political party and support the government in where the money's going. Madam Acting Deputy President, some might say I'm having a bob each way in this debate, but I'm a realist. I understand that the Labor Party is voting with the government, and my voice opposed to this will be not particularly relevant. So the money will flow, and acknowledging that, I'm delighted with the government's commitment, which I think the Labor Party supported, which means a lot more money will go into roads around the country. And indeed, I understand that Senator Cormann has already indicated on behalf of the government that an additional $1.1 billion from this excise money will go into roads to recovery. Sorry? Well, I'll thank you now, Senator Collins, if you had something to do with that. But people come up to me and explain how good roads to recovery is. Well, can I say, I don't need to be told about roads to recovery. I was the minister, as Minister for Local Government, that actually in this chamber introduced the Roads to Recovery program, probably the best program for rural and regional Australia particularly, although it does apply to capital cities as well, but it's a program that does enable local councils to look after their roadworks with their rate base certainly wasn't able to do. And it has been, as I always used to say to John Howard, this has been the most popular program you have ever introduced in rural and regional Australia. So Roads to Recovery has done marvellous things over the period of time. There was some thought under the Labor term that they'd cut back on that, but pressured on that they didn't. I'm delighted to see that program that was introduced in this chamber back in 2001, I think it was, has actually continued since that time, and has done such a lot to help rural and regional people, particularly in getting decent roadworks out there. Now, the Greens wouldn't understand this. I suspect Senator Lazarus, who always supports the Greens, wouldn't understand this either, because rarely are they in rural and remote Australia. They don't understand the importance of Roads to Recovery funding to rural communities right across the nation, and that's why, of course, the Howard government introduced it. And I'm delighted at Senator Cormann's indication that an additional $1.1 billion is going into the Roads to Recovery program. So, having been so praiseworthy of what's going to happen with the money, why am I opposing this? Madam Acting Deputy President, I oppose this because any fuel increase, be it by way of government tax or by way of international oil company profits, impacts more heavily on those who live in rural and regional Australia. Now, I asked Mr Hockey at the last budget whether any modelling had been done by the federal government on the impact of an increase in excise on rural and regional Australia, as opposed to the privileged of our fellow citizens who live in the suburbs of the major cities and towns of our nation. Mr Hockey did give me something. It wasn't, I have to say, with respect to Mr Hockey and Treasury who did it, it wasn't particularly persuasive. But Madam Acting Deputy President, I don't have the figures. I don't have the resources to get the figures, and this debate has come on a little earlier than I might have expected. But I do know from my own experiences over 25 years trying to help people in the state I represent, the state of Queensland, but particularly those who live distances from the capital cities, I do know the impact of any increase in fuel on the cost of living for people in those areas. Now, people who live in areas remote from the capital cities already are disadvantaged, and you don't have to be Einstein to work out that if you've got to get goods from the capital city to where I live in Ayr, you've got a 1,000-kilometre road hike, which a transport company has to bring the goods there. Of course, things have got to cost more. And we who live in the country, we accept that. There are advantages of living in the country, but the cost of living is always more. If I want to go and see a specialist doctor from my town, I have to drive 100 kilometres, and that's $100 kilometres worth of fuel, just to go and see a doctor that if you lived in a capital city, you could get on your suburban train and go in and stop outside the door. Cost you, what's a suburban train ride these days? $10? I don't know. Rarely do it, I have to confess. But certainly a lot less than paying for the petrol. But that's me. I'm pretty privileged. I live in a small country community that's only 100 kilometres away from Townsville, a major northern city with all services. But if you happen to live in Croydon or in Normanton or Julia Creek or Birdsville, just for the normal costs of living, education, getting your kids to school, getting to see any sort of a doctor, it costs a lot more. And where does the cost come? It comes because you have to drive there, and to get there in your car you've got to put fuel into the fuel tank. And so every time fuel increases, the cost of fuel, be it by government excise or otherwise, the cost of living to people in rural and regional Australia increased. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, I know an instance up on the Gilbert River in the Gulf country of Queensland where a mother drives her children 80 kilometres to school in the morning, comes back, that's 160 kilometres, to do her work on the entity they're involved in, and then in the afternoon drives another 80 kilometres back to the town and 80 kilometres back. So that's, 320 kilometres a day just to get the kids to school. Just to get the kids to school. And, Madam Acting Deputy President, the cost to that person is enormous, but it's never thought of by the Greens. There isn't, unfortunately, a tram running from Georgetown to the upper Gilbert River to service, to allow these kids to get to school. Well, I'd love it, but where's your proposal? Are you ever likely to have a suburban rail network going from Georgetown, population 400, to the upper Gilbert, population about 50? Population about 50. How stupid, how unrealistic, how completely removed from reality are the Greens political party. And that's why they're concentrated on the inner city latte set, who can easily jump on the tram, jump on the train, get the public
Senator
bus.
MacDonald, resume your seat, please. Senators are entitled to be heard in silence, so let's have silence. Thank you, Senator MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Acting President. Thank you for protecting me from this vicious attack by the Greens political party. Unfortunately, I didn't hear the interjection about coal seam gas, but that's a matter for another debate, except to say for you and your mate Senator Lazarus, in Queensland where the coal seam gas is, the LNP won every single seat in the last state election. And so, if we do live in a democracy, if we do live where the voices of people count, then you know what the people think about coal seam gas, in spite of you and your mate Senator Lazarus trying to build up some support in an area who I might say are made up of very sensible people who know how they're voting, and that's why every single seat in southwest Queensland at the last Queensland election went to the LNP. But I'm distracted, Madam Acting Deputy President. I come back to this very serious subject. of the cost of living to people in the bush, and I've given one small example. There are a million examples I could give if time permitted, but they would be repetitive. The one that I've given, the couple I've given, clearly explain that. Now, Madam Acting Deputy President, I understand the government has to raise money, and if they raised it from the people who have the advantage of getting on the suburban train or on the tram or on the public bus, if they want to raise it for them, that's fine. I remember, Madam Acting Deputy President, some years ago now, and regrettably the details have escaped me a little, but during the Fraser years there was a scheme in place where petrol anywhere in Australia would be no more than 5 cents a litre dearer than it is in the capital cities. Now, I'm not sure why that was ever stopped. I suspect the voting strength of people in the rural and regional areas wasn't sufficient to continue successive governments in continuing that program. But that was a good scheme that should be looked at again, and in one way would help ameliorate the often very great disparity in the price of fuel in remoter areas. And of course that price of fuel and the fact that rural people of necessity must use their cars longer and more often than those in the city means that again the cost of living for people in the country is bigger. Now, I know the government perhaps even misguidedly think that by giving more money to roads to recovery that will help rural people and might be in some form of compensation. But as I've pointed out, Roads to Recovery goes to the Brisbane City Council as well. I don't begrudge them it, but of course you know the Brisbane City Council has a budget bigger than the state of Tasmania. So it doesn't really compensate. Now, there are other programs that this government has done for rural and regional people that do recognise the cost disadvantages of living in the country. But nothing impacts on life in areas 100 or 200 kilometres from major cities. Nothing impacts more on those people than the cost of fuel. Just to get the kids to school, to get the kids to their sporting events, to get to doctors, you know, for a lot of Australians, to see a doctor involves $500,000 or $600,000, $700,000 plane flight to the next committee, or it involves driving those sort of distances, and every time you put up the cost of fuel, those people suffer. Now, Mr Acting Deputy President, because I said so a year ago and made the commitment, as I say, to myself and to the people I represent, but more importantly, because it is a huge impact on people living remote from the major cities and towns in our community, I do oppose this and will always oppose it. I was in Parliament when the Howard government stopped the automatic indexation of fuel, and I thought that was one of the best decisions. Another very good decision of the Howard government, one, as I said, was Roads to Recovery. This was another one, stopping the automatic indexation. Why? Because it had a beneficial effect to those people who live remote from the services that we all need for our daily lives. So, Madam Acting Deputy President, I conclude where I started. It will distress me having to vote with the Greens on anything, but I will be voting against this legislation. But I emphasise on completely different grounds, to what the Greens. In fact, diametrically opposed are the grounds that I oppose this. I have no truck with the arguments the Greens have and will make on this subject, and I'd like to hear Senator Milne's next contribution, how she understands the plight of people living, you know, 1,000 kilometres away from a major city. I don't think the state Senator Milnes represents has any communities more than 1,000 kilometres away from the capital city. But it'll be interesting to hear that. But, Madam Acting Deputy President, it's with some regret that I'll be voting against my own government, but I do so in furtherance of my long-held view that people who live in the country should not be disadvantaged any more than need be by where they live, and increases in the price of fuel do certainly increase that disadvantage, which I will fight against forever.
Senator Mills.